The river was calm. Too calm. Rick smiled as he poured the wine. "Happy 74th, Maggie." Susan stood behind me, silent, tense. I took a sip, then everything spun. My vision blurred. My legs gave out. "What? What did you put in my drink?" I croaked. Rick grabbed my arms, dragging me toward the dock. Susan followed, but didn't stop him. "You're old, Mama," she whispered. "It's time to let go." Let go? Into the river? Was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, really letting him kill me? For a house? If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. They say the river can chill your bones, but I have learned that no cold water compares to the emptiness in the eyes of your own child when she turns against you. That kind of cold does not seep only into your skin. It goes deeper. It freezes your heart solid. I carry that truth with me every day, because on my 74th birthday, my only daughter and her husband tried to end my life by pushing me into the very river that raised me. My name is Margaret O'Connor, though folks around here call me Maggie. I am 83 years old now, with more years behind me than ahead, but the river still runs in my veins. I live in a small wooden cabin on the edge of Lake Havasu City, Arizona, overlooking the Colorado River. That river almost became my grave, yet it also gave me back to the shore, battered but alive. Neighbors sometimes call me the old woman who beat the river. I let them say it, because I did. I swam for hours, fighting currents and exhaustion, and somehow lived to tell the story. But this is not just a story about swimming. It is about betrayal, survival, and the strange kind of strength you only discover when the people you love most decide you are worth more dead than alive. I was born in Page, Arizona, in a shack so close to the water that we had to stack furniture on bricks whenever the river rose too high. My father, Patrick O'Connor, was a respected river guide. He knew every bend of the Colorado, every rock, every hidden pool where the fish lingered. My mother, Mary, never lived to see me grow. She died giving birth to me, leaving my father to raise me with the help of neighbors. Folks say she held me once, whispered my name, then slipped away. That loss defined me long before I understood what it meant. From my earliest memory, the river was my teacher. My father would toss me into the shallows and say, "Maggie, the river won't wait on you. Learn to swim." I flailed, swallowed water, cried, but eventually I swam. By the time I was 3, I could glide like a little fish, and by 5 I was diving for shells. The Colorado was not just water to me. It was alive, moody, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. And my father drilled into me one rule that I never forgot. Respect the river, Maggie, but never fear it. Anyone who fears the river has already lost. That rule saved me more than once. And it saved me on the day my daughter tried to take my life. I look out my porch today, across the glittering water, and I think of that moment when the world I thought I knew shattered. My daughter, Susan, once my pride and joy, once the child I had sacrificed everything for, stood silently while her husband shoved me into the current. I remember her face. Not twisted with anger, not even with triumph, but with something worse, a kind of empty resignation, as if she had already decided that my life was worth less than the value of the land under my cabin. You do not forget a look like that. It is colder than any river water could ever be. That day the river was calm, the sky cloudless, the sun warm. A perfect day for a boat ride, or so I thought. My daughter told me it was a surprise for my birthday. She said Rick, her husband, wanted to take me out on the water. Fool that I was, I believed it was an act of kindness, a way to reconnect. Instead, it was a plan to make my death look like an accident. Who would question it? An old woman in her 70s, falling off a boat by mistake? No one would doubt it. At least, that's what they thought. But they forgot who I was. I was raised on these waters. I knew the river better than I knew my own face in the mirror. When Rick's hands shoved me overboard, when the cold hit me like a slap, I didn't panic. I looked first at my father's old waterproof watch, still strapped to my wrist. It was ticking. If it could keep going, so could I. That watch was more than metal and gears. It was a piece of him, and it became a piece of my will to survive. I swam for hours that day, ate by the measure of the watch, though in truth time lost all meaning. Every stroke burned. Every breath scraped my lungs raw. There were moments I thought of letting go, letting the water take me like it had taken my father so many years ago. But each time that thought crept in, I remembered the faces of those who had once believed in me, the people I had loved, and even the river itself seemed to whisper, "Not yet, Maggie, not yet." When I finally crawled out onto the harbor pier, half dead but alive, the first people I saw were Susan and Rick. They were docking the boat, preparing their lies. And then they saw me, soaked, trembling, but standing. The color drained from Rick's face. Susan staggered as though she had seen a ghost, and maybe she had. Because that day, the woman they had conspired to kill was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, someone who would never let them forget what they had done. Now, nearly 10 years later, I sit on my porch watching the Colorado glitter in the evening sun. The same water that nearly swallowed me laughs under the sky, restless and eternal. And I know one thing. Survival is not just about keeping your head above water. It is about finding a reason to keep breathing after the world you trusted collapses. It is about turning betrayal into something stronger than bitterness. My story is not about how I almost died. It is about how I chose to live. People think courage is something you're born with, like blue eyes or strong bones. But that's not true. Courage is built, stroke by stroke, just like a swimmer cutting through the current. My courage was forged long before Rick ever laid hands on me, long before I learned to swim across the deepest parts of the Colorado. It began with a man who smelled of river mud and pipe smoke, whose rough hands could fix a broken engine or braid my pigtails just the same. My father, Patrick O'Connor, gave me everything I needed to survive long after he was gone. I was 5 when I swam my first full loop around Horseshoe Bend. Most kids that age were still trying to float, still flailing in backyard pools under their mother's nervous eyes. Not me. My father didn't believe in babying. "The river's not going to wait until you feel ready, Maggie," he said. "You move with it, or it moves without you." Page. Arizona wasn't much back then, dust, rock, and folks tough as saddle leather. We lived in a shack patched with tin sheets and newspaper insulation, just a stone's throw from the Colorado. There was no school bus, no supermarket. But we had the river, and that was enough for us. It was our road, our food, our story. My father made his living as a river guide, taking tourists and fishermen on long days through winding canyons. People came from all over to ride with Patrick O'Connor. Even if he charged more than others, they said he had a sixth sense for weather and water, that he could read the river like a map written in motion. And he could. I'd watch him squint at the sky, sniff the breeze, and say, "Storm's coming, we head home." He was never wrong. When I was little, I'd beg him to take me on trips. "You'll be bored, Maggie. Grown-ups talk too much," he'd say, but eventually he relented. I'd sit between his boots, wrapped in a life vest that dwarfed me, wide-eyed as the cliffs zipped past. He'd point out the herons, the twisted cottonwoods, the places where the rocks whispered stories if you listened right. But he never let me think the river was safe. "The water doesn't care about you, baby girl," he told me once, his voice low and serious. "It won't stop to ask if you can swim or scream. It just keeps going. That's why you respect it. You never turn your back on it." Those words rang in my ears the day he didn't come home. It was July. I remember the heat dry, blistering, pressing against your chest like a hot hand. My father had taken a group of 3 out-of-towners up through Marble Canyon, promising a sunset ride back. I watched the sky that evening from our porch, chewing on a green apple, feet swinging off the edge. Clouds were building, tall and dark like towers of smoke. I didn't know enough yet to be scared, but I could feel something wrong. Helen Thompson, our neighbor, came by around dusk. She was a widow who kept to herself mostly, but she had a kind heart. "You seen your daddy?" she asked, her eyes on the clouds. I shook my head. "He's guiding tourists." She frowned. "He should have turned back hours ago. That wind's not right." The storm hit fast. No thunder at first, just a wall of wind that toppled a stack of firewood and sent dust swirling like a devil's dance. Then came the rain hard, slanting, bitter. I stood at the window until Helen pulled me away. "Come sit down, Maggie," she said gently, but I wouldn't. I waited all night. Morning came, and still no sign of him. They found the overturned boat near Horseshoe Bend. The tourists had made it to shore, bruised and rattled, but alive. They said my father had turned them toward safety when the storm rolled in. They remembered his voice above the wind, barking orders, keeping them calm. But somewhere in the chaos, the boat capsized. My father never resurfaced. I didn't cry when they told me. I remember that clearly. I just stared at the deputy like he was lying. Then I walked out to the riverbank, barefoot, and sat in the mud. I stayed there until Helen came to fetch me, wrapped me in her arms and said, "He's with the river now, sweetheart," just like he always was. All they found of him was his watch, a waterproof, brass-faced timepiece he always wore on his left wrist. The strap had snapped, but the hands were still ticking. Helen gave it to me in a box lined with flannel. I carried it with me every day after that, even after it stopped working years later. When the battery died, I didn't replace it. I didn't need the time. I just needed to remember. I became quiet after that. Grown-ups used words like withdrawn and delayed grief, but really, I was just listening. To the river, to the wind, to the way the rocks whispered at night. I listened for him, and I swam longer, harder, deeper. I'd sneak down before dawn, slide into the cold like it was home. I wasn't afraid. If anything, I was hoping to see him again, to hear his voice under the surface. By the time I turned 15, I knew every curve of the river, from Glen Canyon Dam to Lee's Ferry. I could read the clouds like he used to, knew which birds meant storms and which meant safe sailing. People began asking me questions about currents and timing. Old fishermen started nodding to me, saying, "Pat's girl's got his blood." I decided that year I'd become the first female guide in the region. The idea made folks laugh at first. "Girl like you should be thinking about marriage," one man said at the gas station. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'm already married to the river." It wasn't easy. I had to fight for every chance, work twice as hard for half the credit. But I had his name, and that meant something. By 17, I had my license. By 20, I was leading tours on my own, and every time I took a group out, I wore his watch on my wrist. Even after all these years, the river still carries echoes of him. Sometimes I'll be drifting past the canyon walls and swear I hear his voice on the wind. Not words exactly, just the feeling of him, the way it settles into my chest like a memory too old for language. I wonder if he saw me that day. Rick tried to end me, if he reached out from somewhere beneath the water and said, "Not yet, Maggie, not yet." What I know for certain is this. The river took him, but it gave me strength. It taught me how to lose, how to keep going, how to find my own breath when everything else is trying to drown you. My father died when I was 12, but his lessons stayed alive. They live in my hands, in my spine, in every stroke I ever swam. And they lived in me the day I pulled myself from the river's grip, years later, bruised but unbeaten. That's why I never left this place. The cabin, the river, the hills, they're not just home. They're the bones of my past. And no matter how much Susan and Rick wanted to erase me from this land, they didn't understand one thing. You can't steal something that's part of your blood. If grief was the tide that shaped me, then love was the sun that dried me off and taught me to stand again. I was 19 when I met Frank Miller. And for the first time since my father vanished beneath the current, I believed the river might also carry gifts, not just take them away. Frank wasn't from the river. He was from Prescott, a town of pine trees and high desert wind, where people wore flannel year-round and said, "Ma'am," without a trace of irony. He'd come to Lake Havasu City the same year I started guiding boats full-time, back when the London Bridge had just been rebuilt and tourists were starting to trickle in. He worked behind the counter at the only hardware store in town, tall and quiet, always with a pencil behind his ear and grease on his hands. I first met him when my outboard motor refused to start, and I came stomping into the shop with half a carburetor in my hand and a temper burning bright. He looked at the mess I'd made and said, "You planning to rebuild this or murder it?" I almost walked out right there, but then he smiled, slow, crooked, genuine, and I laughed despite myself. He fixed the motor. Then he fixed my heart. Frank wasn't flashy. He didn't know the river like I did, didn't have stories about thunderstorms and cliffs that echoed secrets. But he listened, really listened. When I talked about my father, about how the river whispered to me when the world went quiet, he didn't roll his eyes. He just nodded, handed me a cup of coffee, and said, "Sounds like he'd be proud of you." We married in a small ceremony by the water, just a circle of friends, Helen baking a lemon cake in her tiny oven, and Tom Bradley giving a toast that ended with him crying into his beer. Frank built us a cabin just down the river from where I grew up. 2 rooms, a screened-in porch, and a tiny dock. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I still live in that cabin today. When I became pregnant, I didn't think I could love anything more than I loved Frank. But when they placed Susan in my arms, wrapped like a tiny burrito with her father's nose and my stubborn jaw, the world tilted. Everything I had was hers, every breath, every beat of my heart. I didn't know it then, but the love you have for your child, it's the kind that makes you forget where you end and they begin. Frank sold his share of the hardware store and opened a small supply shop for river guides, bait, lures, maps, gear. I cut back on my river tours, only taking the occasional sunrise trip when Susan was with Helen or one of the other neighbor ladies. We were happy, in the quiet way that doesn't make headlines but leaves deep grooves in your memory. Susan was bright, sharp as a tack. Even as a toddler, she asked questions that stumped grown men. "Why is the moon broken?" she once asked, pointing at a crescent. "Why don't fish blink?" Another time, she fell into a muddy bank, chasing a frog, and when I pulled her out, she said solemnly, "Now I'm part of the river, like Grandpa." I just held her tighter. We didn't have much money, but we had enough. Frank made sure of that. He was the kind of man who repaired instead of replaced, who reused string, who saved every receipt in a shoebox. I worried sometimes that Susan would grow up resenting our small life. She saw other kids with new bikes, vacations to Disneyland, shiny plastic toys we couldn't afford. But every night, I sang her to sleep, brushed her hair, and told her stories about the river, about the grandfather she never met. When Susan turned 10, Frank got sick. It started with a cough, then came the weight loss, the night sweats, the fatigue. The doctor called it lung cancer. Frank hadn't smoked a day in his life. That didn't matter. The cancer didn't care. He fought, but it was a quiet kind of fight. No dramatics, no self-pity. He tried to shield us from the worst of it, but I saw. I saw the man who once carried me across the river now struggle to climb our porch steps. I saw the fear in his eyes at night when he thought I wasn't looking. Susan was 12 when he died, old enough to understand loss, too young to carry it alone. We buried him under a mesquite tree overlooking the river. Susan pressed one of his old pencils into the soil, whispering something I couldn't hear. I sat beside her, holding her hand, and for the first time in years, I felt small again. After Frank died, everything changed. I went back to guiding part-time, more out of necessity than love. The river that once soothed me now mocked me with its indifference. Bills piled up, the house creaked with silence. Susan became quieter, her laughter rare and guarded. I tried to fill the void with double the love, double the stories, double the effort. But some holes don't get patched with effort. They just become part of the landscape. Still, I pushed on. I made sure Susan had everything she needed for school books, lunch money, even a computer when those became mandatory. I worked nights, cleaning cabins at the lake resort, took odd jobs translating tour brochures for Spanish-speaking tourists, even taught swim lessons at the public pool. She never saw any of that. I never let her. To her, I was just Mom. Always smiling, always fine. That's what we do, isn't it? We mothers. We bleed quietly, cry in the shower, and then make pancakes like nothing's wrong. Susan got into college on a scholarship. She chose accounting, practical, stable. I was proud. I cried when she left, standing on the dock waving as the Greyhound bus swallowed her. I spent weeks keeping her room exactly as she left it, down to the mismatched socks and half-empty lotion bottles. When she came home that first summer, she was different. Not bad, just grown, more polished. She talked about tax law and city planning like they were fairy tales. She had new clothes, a tighter smile, a hunger behind her eyes I didn't recognize. I blamed myself. Maybe I hadn't given her enough. Maybe she'd grown up thinking small dreams weren't dreams at all. Then she brought home Rick. He walked like a man who'd never had to ask twice for anything. That was my first impression of Rick Lawson. He had a grin that stretched too wide, shoes too clean for river dust, and a handshake that squeezed like he was measuring your worth. Susan introduced him with a kind of nervous pride, the way a kid shows off a trophy they're not sure they earned. I remember wiping my hands on my apron and stepping out onto the porch to meet him. The river was quiet behind us, just a low hush of water against the dock. I remember thinking how much that silence clashed with the man standing in front of me. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. O'Connor," he said, his voice smooth as fresh paint. "Susan's told me all about this place." I nodded politely, studied his eyes. He had the look of a man who noticed details but not for their beauty, for their price. Rick was a real estate broker, just getting started in Lake Havasu. He spoke in square footage and potential resale value. To him, a house wasn't a home, it was an opportunity. And worse, Susan had started to talk the same way. That summer, the air between us began to shift. Susan was no longer content with river walks or late-night stories on the porch. She rolled her eyes at my stories about the old days, about Frank, about the time the river flooded and we had to tie the furniture down. "Mom, that's not how people live anymore," she said one night. "You act like we're stuck in a time capsule." I'd never heard her say that before. Or maybe I'd never heard her say it with such distance. Rick, for his part, was polite. Too polite. He complimented the woodwork in the cabin, asked questions about the property line, the title, the utilities. Not in a curious way, in a calculating one. I watched him eye the handmade cabinets Frank had built, the river access, the acre of land that, yes, had probably quadrupled in value over the years. One night after dinner, as we sipped iced tea on the porch, he said, "You know, Maggie, you're sitting on a gold mine here." I looked at him hard. "I'm sitting on memories." He laughed, but his eyes didn't. "Sure. But memories don't pay for retirement homes, do they?" That was the first time I felt the chill. It wasn't from the river. It was from the realization that he saw me not as a mother, not even as a person, but as an obstacle. After that visit, Susan called less. When she did, she spoke in clipped sentences, as if fitting me between meetings. She sent holiday cards printed with gold foil and professional headshots. There was a wall now, one brick at a time, built from ambition, distance, and a man with an expensive watch. 2 years later, they got married in Scottsdale. I wasn't invited. That hurt, not like a knife, more like a slow, spreading frost. She called after the ceremony, said it had been small, just close friends and colleagues. She said, "It didn't feel right without Dad, and honestly, you've never really gotten along with Rick." I wanted to scream. I wanted to say I didn't care about Rick, that I'd have walked barefoot through cactus to be there for her. But I just said, "I hope you're happy, Susan. Now, too." Because sometimes being a mother means swallowing your pain so your child can breathe easier. They visited twice in the next 5 years. Both times, Rick talked about the market. "You could sell this place and live in comfort," he said. "Susan and I could help you find a condo closer to the city, somewhere with medical services, elevators, you know, things people your age need." I knew what he meant. Smaller space, easier to manage, easier to control, easier to forget, but I wasn't ready to be shelved. "This cabin isn't a burden," I told them once. "It's the only thing in this world that still feels like home." Rick smiled thinly. "Home is where you feel safe, Maggie. And the way I see it, this place is one bad fall away from a lawsuit." He always said things like that, wrapped threats in concern, made greed sound like generosity, and Susan, my Susan, nodded along. The worst part wasn't losing her warmth. It was watching her adopt his vocabulary. She stopped saying cabin and started saying asset. She stopped asking about the fish and started asking about the property taxes. I still remember the day I found a man in a suit taking photos of the land. I walked out with a shovel over my shoulder and asked if he was lost. He stammered something about preliminary appraisals and got in his car fast. I called Susan that night. "Why is someone surveying my property?" She was quiet for too long. Then she said, "Rick was just exploring options. You don't have to get upset." Options. That's what I had become. It all came to a head on my 74th birthday. They arrived early that morning, unannounced, carrying a basket of fruit and a bottle of wine I couldn't pronounce. Susan hugged me stiffly. Rick kissed my cheek like I was his elderly client. "Thought we'd do something special today," he said. "Take the boat out for a spin. You haven't been on the river in years." End of quote. That was a lie. I went out every week, but I said yes. Partly because I hoped, maybe foolishly, that this was an olive branch. That maybe they remembered who I was. That maybe my daughter still loved me. We packed a cooler, loaded into my old pontoon, and drifted along the shoreline. The sun was warm, the sky a perfect blue. Rick took the wheel. Susan sat beside me, sunglasses hiding her eyes. I talked about the osprey nesting upriver. She didn't respond. Somewhere near Deadman's Bend, Rick slowed the boat. I looked around. "Why are we stopping?" He turned to me, eyes hard now. "Because this is as far as you go." Then I felt it, his hands on my back. The shove, the cold shock of water swallowing me. The last thing I saw before I went under was Susan's face. Expressionless. The river was cold, colder than I remembered, colder than it should have been for summer. It seized my lungs in a vice grip the moment I went under, stealing my breath like a thief in the night. For one terrible second, I didn't fight. I just drifted, stunned, suspended in the murky green, watching the light above me twist and blur like some distant, unreachable memory. Then I kicked. Instinct, legacy, rage. I burst through the surface with a gasp so loud it startled a pair of nearby herons. My limbs flailed, heavy and slow. The current pulled me sideways, turning the world into a blur of sky and splash. The boat was already drifting away. I saw Rick's silhouette behind the wheel. I saw Susan not moving, not looking. "Help!" I cried, not because I expected them to, because some small part of me needed to hear myself still try. But they didn't turn around. The motor groaned back to life, and the boat curved away from me like a closing door. I was alone, completely, painfully alone. I floated on my back for a minute, trying to calm the panic that throbbed in my chest. I could hear my father's voice, faint but steady. "The river doesn't care, Maggie. That's why you have to." I looked down at my wrist. The watch. His watch. Still strapped tight. Ticking. It gave me something to hold on to. I turned over, kicked hard, and started swimming with the current, not against it. You don't fight the Colorado. You bargain with it. You whisper promises, adjust your angle, ride her like a wild horse, never looking away. The shoreline was distant, blurred through the spray. The wind had picked up, and small waves slapped at my face with the indifference of fate. My breath came in ragged pulls. My joints ached. But I knew this river. I had swum it as a girl. I had braved it at night, in storms, when others wouldn't dare. Still, this was different. I was 74 years old. My muscles weren't what they used to be. My shoulders burned after the first half mile. My fingers started to cramp, but I kept them moving, one over the other, pulling the water like rope. I thought of Frank, of his quiet strength. I thought of Susan as a baby, giggling in a tin tub by the dock. I thought of my father watching me from the cliffs. I thought of all I had given my youth, my energy, my dreams. And for what? To be cast aside like driftwood? Number. Not like this. Stroke. Breathe. Stroke. Breathe. I don't remember much of the second hour. My body shifted into survival mode, pure instinct. Every part of me screamed, but I refused to stop. I kept my eyes fixed on the far shoreline, where the rocks broke the horizon like jagged teeth. I had to make it past those. If I drifted too far south, I'd hit the gorge too deep, too wide. No one survived that. Birds circled overhead. The sky began to tilt, shadows lengthening. Time had become elastic. I watched the sun drop slowly toward the hills and realized this wasn't going to be a few minutes. This was going to be hours. By the third hour, I began to talk to myself. Not out loud, in my head. I recited recipes, the multiplication tables, the names of every fish in the river. I listed every address I'd ever lived at. I named every kind word Frank had ever said to me. It kept me sane. It kept me conscious. At some point, My foot snagged on something below brush, maybe a rock, and I sank briefly. The shock nearly ended me. My lungs sucked in water. I choked, surfaced, gasped. I wanted to quit. Truly, deeply, wanted to let go. But then, a memory. Susan, 5 years old, standing on the dock with her arms outstretched, yelling, "Jump, Mama! I'll catch you!" I remembered the way her eyes had sparkled, the way she had believed in me with her whole little heart. That girl, my girl, was still in there somewhere, maybe buried beneath years of ambition, beneath Rick's influence, beneath fear. But she was there, and I wasn't going to leave her to wonder what happened to her mother. I wasn't going to vanish like my father had. Number. Not yet. I kept going. Stroke. Breathe. Stroke. Breathe. Around the 5th hour, I began to hallucinate. I saw figures on the shore, Helen, Tom, even Frank, standing with a towel, waving me in. I saw my father in the current, swimming beside me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never speaking, but always near. I cried in the water, sobbed into the wind. It mixed with the river spray and made no difference. The stars were beginning to show when I saw it. The harbor light, a small, blinking beacon near the public dock where teenagers snuck out to kiss, where tourists boarded boats in the early morning. It was far miles, maybe, but it was real. I locked my eyes on it and kicked harder. My strokes were sloppy now, uneven. My breath rattled. My arms trembled with every lift. But I aimed for that light, like it was salvation. Because it was. The final stretch was the longest of my life. I don't remember climbing onto the dock, only the feeling of wood under my hands, of rough boards scraping my belly, of cold air hitting my soaked skin like knives. I collapsed on my side, coughing water, lungs heaving. I heard voices, footsteps, gasps, and then, nothing. I don't remember the ride to the hospital, but I remember the first face I saw when I woke up. It was Ed Ramirez. He looked older than I, remembered more lines on his forehead, gray threading through his hair, but the kindness in his eyes was the same. He'd been a wiry teenager when I first met him, working summers as a river assistant, always asking questions, always trying to prove himself. Frank used to call him the most polite pain in the neck on this side of the river. After his mother passed, we helped him fill out college applications. Frank even loaned him money for textbooks. Years later, Ed became an attorney, opened a small practice in Kingman, and never forgot where he came from. Now he was leaning over my hospital bed, gently placing a cup of lukewarm tea on the tray table. His voice was low. "Maggie, you scared the hell out of everyone." He blinked slowly. My throat felt like sandpaper, my arms too heavy to lift. I whispered, "How? How long?" "Almost 9 hours," he said. "You were severely hypothermic, dehydrated, borderline organ failure. But you made it. Doc says you're stubborn as a mule." I tried to smile. It came out more like a grimace. Then, after a pause, "Do they know?" Ed's face darkened. "Rick and Susan?" "Number. At least not yet. They think you fell. Boating accident. Unfortunate, no witnesses, of course." I nodded slowly. "Of course." He leaned closer. "You want to go to the police?" The question hung in the air like a fishing line, taut and trembling. And I said, "Number." He blinked. "No?" I turned my head to the window. The light outside was fading, casting long shadows across the pale tile floor. Not yet, because what I wanted wasn't just justice. It was clarity. I needed to understand what had broken in Susan. What had hollowed her out so deeply she could stand by and watch me drown. I needed to know how much of her was still my daughter, and how much of her belonged to the man she'd married. Besides, I knew Rick. He was too clever to leave evidence. No cameras, no witnesses. It would be my word against theirs. And a 74-year-old woman slipping off a boat? It wasn't exactly headline material. No, I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted the truth. And I wanted my hands on the only thing they still coveted, the cabin. So, I asked Ed for something else. "I need to change my will," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "To cut her out?" I nodded. "Every inch, every right. The land, the cabin, the dock, all of it. I want it transferred to the Arizona River Safety Initiative. I want it used as a training and education facility for kids, for future guides, for anyone who wants to understand what the river gives and what it can take. Ed sat back slowly, the weight of the idea sinking in. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once it's done, it's permanent. No going back." "I'm sure," I said, "and I want Susan to know." He smiled, not unkindly. "That'll sting more than jail time." I recovered in silence. No press, no visitors. Only Ed, a few nurses, and the humming machines that tracked my pulse. When I was strong enough to return home, escorted quietly, under cover of night, Susan was already there. She was on the porch, pacing, arms crossed, cell phone pressed to her ear. She froze when she saw me. For a moment, I thought she might run to me, that maybe guilt had cracked something open inside her. But she just stood there. "Mama?" she said, like she wasn't sure if I was real. "You," we thought. "You thought wrong," I said. Rick appeared behind her. His expression crumpled like a cheap suit. "My God," he stammered. "You're alive?" I didn't answer. I walked right past them, up the steps, and into my home. Everything was exactly as I left it, which meant they'd been too afraid to touch anything. Good. I sat in my chair by the window, took a slow breath, and then I said calmly, "Pack your things. You're not welcome here anymore." Susan flinched. "Mama, please." "No," I said, my voice steel. "You made your choice." Rick stepped forward. "You can't prove anything. There were no witnesses, no recordings. It was an accident." I looked him dead in the eye. "You're right. I can't prove it. But I don't need to." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I've changed my will. This property? It's no longer an asset for you to snatch. It belongs to the river now, to the people who respect it, to kids who need to learn how to survive it." Rick turned red. "You can't do that." I smiled. "Already did." Susan's face broke then. Not in anger. In something worse, regret. Real. Gut deep regret. She sank onto the porch swing, silent. Rick stormed off, muttering about lawyers. But I knew the truth. He was already beaten. Because I had taken away the only thing he valued. Control. That night, Susan came back inside, stood by the kitchen sink, arms limp at her sides. "I didn't think he'd really push you," she said softly. "I thought maybe he'd talk to you again, convince you. I didn't. I didn't think he'd go that far. But you still got on the boat," I said. She nodded, eyes rimmed with tears. "I was tired, Mama. Tired of struggling. Tired of always being one step behind everyone else. Rick said this would fix everything." I didn't answer. "Because what do you say to that?" She left before dawn, took only a suitcase and a folded-up apology she never read aloud. I haven't seen her since. But sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I think I hear her voice on the breeze, calling from the dock like she used to when she was little. And I whisper, "I'm still here, baby." Even if she's not, there's a strange kind of peace that settles over you when you've already survived the worst thing you could imagine. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like surrender, but not the kind that means giving up. It's the kind that means starting over, on your terms. After Susan left, and Rick disappeared into whatever dark corner of the world he crawled from, I expected to feel empty. But what surprised me most was the sense of clarity. The air tasted sharper, the colors were brighter. Even the sound of the river seemed more honest. I was alive. And I wasn't just alive, I was free. Free from pretending. Free from hoping people would be who I wanted them to be instead of who they really were. And with that freedom came a question I hadn't dared ask myself in decades. What now? For weeks, I stayed mostly indoors, recovering. My body ached in ways that told stories my mouth never would. The doctor said I'd never regain full strength in my right shoulder, that the damage from the cold water and the strain would linger. I told him it didn't matter. That shoulder had already done its job. But restlessness grew in me like a seed in spring. One morning I stood on the dock watching a group of local boys throw rocks into the river. They were loud, reckless, daring each other to get closer to the edge. One of them, a wiry boy with a mop of curly hair, stepped out too far, slipped, and fell in with a splash. The others panicked. The boy couldn't swim. Before I even realized what I was doing, I was in the water. My body moved on memory. The cold bit my skin, but I pushed through it, reached him, pulled him in like I'd done 100 times before. He coughed, clung to me, shaking. "You okay?" I asked, brushing the wet hair from his face. He nodded, eyes wide. That's when I knew. This river had nearly taken my life. Twice. But maybe it could still give me purpose. The next week, I posted a flyer at the local grocery store. Free river safety lessons, ages 8 to 16, Sundays at the public dock. I didn't expect much. Maybe a curious parent or two. Maybe 1 or 2 kids who needed to burn off energy. Instead, on that first Sunday, 15 children showed up. Some barefoot, some in swimsuits too small, a few clinging to the hands of nervous mothers. But they came, and when I asked, "How many of you can swim?" only 2 raised their hands. So we started small. I taught them how to float, how to tread water, how to read the river's current by watching the debris. I taught them how to respect the water, not fear it, not challenge it, but move with it like it was a dance partner. I told them stories about my father, about Frank, about the day I swam for 9 hours because giving up meant never seeing another sunrise. They listened like sponges. One boy, Michael, came every week, rain or shine. 10 years old, quiet, eyes like deep wells. He never talked about his family, but he clung to every word I said, and within a month, he was swimming like he'd been born in the water. He reminded me of myself. One Sunday, after class, he stayed behind. Helped me coil ropes, wipe down the life jackets. "You ever scared out there?" he asked, not looking at me. "All the time," I said. He looked up. "But you still go in, and won. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared," I told him. "It means going in anyway, because someone needs you to." He nodded. "I want to be like you someday." I didn't answer. I just placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "Then listen to the river. It'll teach you how." Word spread. Soon, the local sheriff stopped by to shake my hand. Then a city councilwoman asked if I'd consider applying for a small grant. By the end of the year, the dock had been renovated, and the old shed beside it had been turned into a training center with my name carved above the door, Maggie O'Connor River Safety House. We started calling it the River Grandma Program. Not my idea, but it stuck. At first, I didn't like the sound of it. Made me feel old. But the kids loved it, and it made people smile. Even the tourists started asking about the grandma who swam 8 hours and lived to teach swim lessons, M. It became a story, then a legend, then something more. Michael became my shadow. When he wasn't in school, he was at the dock. I taught him how to tie knots, read weather patterns, handle a canoe. He had a natural rhythm, like he could feel the river in his blood. One evening, as we watched the sunset from the dock, he said, "Why do you do all this for free?" I smiled. "Because someone once taught me for free, and because giving back is the only way I know how to heal." And. He thought about that, then said, "Can I call you Grandma Maggie?" Tears pricked my eyes. "Yeah," I whispered. "You can." The cabin felt less lonely now. Kids came by after school to borrow books. Teenagers asked about internships. Local volunteers dropped off snacks and life vests. Even the mayor came out for our summer fundraiser. The place was alive again. Not because I had money, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I was rooted, like a cottonwood by the river, deep, weathered, and still growing. And the river, oh, the river, it didn't try to take me anymore. It carried me, like it always had. It had been 7 years. 7 long, quiet, river-washed years since Susan had stood on my porch and watched me crawl back into life from the edge of death. Since she packed her things and vanished into a silence that rang louder than any words she could have spoken. I didn't expect to see her again. And truth be told, I'd made peace with that. There's a difference between healing and forgetting. I had healed. I had built something real with my pain, turned it into classes and laughter and river safety lessons, and a legacy far greater than bitterness. But forgetting? Number. Some things stay lodged like splinters in your soul, no matter how long ago the wound closed. So when I saw her car sleek, silver, unfamiliar pull into the gravel driveway one Thursday morning, my breath caught in my throat like cold water. I was standing on the porch, mug in hand, watching Michael teach a younger boy how to tie a bowline knot. The sight of her stepping out of the car didn't feel real at first. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating again, like those long hours in the river. She looked different, thinner, paler. Hair shorter, streaked with gray at the temples. She wore dark sunglasses and clutched a purse to her chest like it was armor. But I knew her. A mother always knows. She stood by the car for a moment, staring at the house. Then she walked toward me. Slowly, cautiously. "Hi," she said. Just that. One word. I didn't answer. I just stared, waiting. She took off her glasses. Her eyes were tired, older. But something flickered behind them, a softness I hadn't seen in decades. "I didn't know if you'd let me in," she said. I took a slow sip from my mug, never breaking eye contact. "That depends," I said. "You here for real? Or just passing through again?" She winced. "I'm here," she said. "Really here, if you'll let me be." I didn't nod, didn't smile. I just stepped aside and opened the door. She walked in like a woman entering sacred ground. Her eyes moved over everything, the same furniture, the same photographs, the same old wooden walls that had held our laughter and arguments and birthdays and tears. She paused at the photo of Frank by the fireplace. "He hasn't changed," she whispered. "He wouldn't," I said. I motioned for her to sit. She didn't. She stood behind the chair, hands gripping the backrest like it might run off without her. "I'm not here to explain what happened," she said, "because there's no excuse." That caught me off guard. She went on. "I was scared, angry, lost. And Rick. He made it easy to believe that taking shortcuts would fix things. That selling the cabin, getting the money, putting you somewhere safe, he made it all sound like love. But it wasn't. It was fear. And I let it rule me. I didn't speak." She took a breath. "After that day, I left him." Now I looked up. She nodded slowly. 2 months later, I packed a bag, filed for divorce, and haven't seen him since. He took everything he could, but I didn't care. I had to go. I still didn't speak. Every year I thought about calling, writing, coming here. But I didn't know what I'd say. What could I say? "Sorry I stood by while the man I married tried to kill you"? There's no card for that, Mama. That word, Mama, hit me like a wave. She wiped her eyes. But then I started seeing articles. About you. About the River Grandma program. The kids. The dock. The new boat. You turned pain into purpose. And I kept thinking, what if she could do the same for me? I leaned back in my chair, set my mug down. "So why now?" She hesitated. "I have cancer." My heart stopped. She nodded, quickly, like trying to beat the wave of emotion. "Lymphoma. Early stage. They caught it in time, they think. Chemo starts next week. I'm going to be okay, maybe. But it made me realize I couldn't keep carrying this. Not if I want to face whatever comes next with a clean soul." I looked at her then not as the woman who'd abandoned me, betrayed me, broken me, but as the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest after long river walks. "You left me," I said, my voice low. "You didn't just betray me. You left. No phone calls, no letters, no apology." "I know," she whispered. "I punished myself every day for it." "Good," I said. That surprised her. She blinked, tears running freely now. "Good," I repeated. "Because if it hadn't hurt you too, then nothing between us would have ever been real. And as broken as we are, I needed to know it mattered to you, even if too late." She nodded. Silence stretched between us, heavy as wet rope. "I'm not asking to stay," she said, "or for you to pretend it never happened. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry, and I miss you." I stood then, walked to the window, watched Michael laughing with the kids, his face full of sunlight and trust. Then I said, "You hurt me deeper than anyone ever could. You shattered something in me I'm not sure will ever heal." She bowed her head. "But," I continued, "this house was built on forgiveness. Frank forgave me when I almost lost it all. My father forgave me when I let the boat drift too far. And this river, it's never once stopped flowing, no matter how much I've failed it." I turned to her. "You want to come back? Earn it. You want to be part of this again? Show up, help teach, clean the dock, Patch life jackets. Show those kids you're more than the woman who walked away. She looked up, hope flickering like a candle. I will, she said. Whatever it takes. I nodded slowly. And for the first time in years, I opened my arms. And my daughter walked into them. Forgiveness isn't a finish line, it's a road. One you walk slowly, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in the rain, and always with more doubt than certainty. After Susan hugged me that day, I didn't tell her everything was okay. Because it wasn't. But I did something I never thought I'd do. I let her stay. Not in the house. That would have been too much, too fast. But in the old guest, shed out back, the one Frank used as a storage room when he was building the dock. It hadn't been touched in years, but Michael and a few of the older boys helped her clean it out. They swept cobwebs, patched the roof, even fixed the little porch light that flickered like a firefly whenever the wind blew just right. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for special treatment. She just worked. The first Sunday after she returned, I half expected her not to show up at the dock. But there she was, standing beside the pile of life vests, tying knots into the frayed ones, organizing the equipment. The kids didn't know who she was at first. To them, she was just another adult with a clipboard and a nervous smile. Michael gave her a wide berth that day, eyeing her like he couldn't quite figure her out. He'd heard stories everyone in town had. Word spreads fast when someone tries to kill their mama and fails. But he also watched me. He watched how I spoke to her, how I didn't flinch when our hands brushed over the first aid kit. So he gave her a chance. The others followed. By the end of the first month, Susan had become Miss Sue to the kids. She helped teach floating techniques, ran relay races, handed out PB, J sandwiches with juice boxes, and always stayed late to clean up. No fanfare, no speeches, just presence. And presence, I've learned, is its own kind of apology. We didn't talk much at first. Some mornings, she'd nod at me across the dock. Some evenings, she'd leave a mason jar of lemonade on my porch. Once, I found a folded piece of paper on my rocking chair, her handwriting short and nervous. I saw the way you taught that boy to hold his breath underwater. I remember when you taught me that. I'd forgotten how much you gave me. I didn't respond. Not with words. But I kept the note, and I didn't throw away the lemonade. One Friday afternoon, a small boy named Danny fell during practice and scraped his knee pretty bad. He wailed like the sky had fallen. I rushed over with the first aid kit, but Susan was already there, crouched low, whispering gently, dabbing at his leg with soft hands and a steady voice. "Hurts, huh?" she said. "That means you're growing. Only strong kids get scrapes like this." He sniffled. "You sure?" She smiled. "Positive. You're tougher than me." He beamed. And I watched her, not as my daughter, not as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone who was finally becoming who she might have always been, if fear hadn't twisted her path. That night, I invited her to dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just chili and cornbread, same as Frank used to make on stormy days. We didn't talk much while we ate. The silence was companionable, not cold. After we'd washed the dishes, she sat on the porch with me, watching the moonlight scatter across the water. "I don't know how long I've got," she said quietly. "None of us do," I replied. "I mean with the treatment. The doctors are hopeful, but—" She trailed off. I didn't look at her, just stared at the river. "You're not defined by your illness," I said. "You're defined by what you do with the days you have left, whether that's 5 years or 50. She nodded, slowly. "I want to make it right, Mama, not just with you. With me. I want to become someone I'm proud of." I finally turned to her. "You don't need to impress me," I said. "You just need to stay honest." And she did. Over the next few months, Susan became the quiet backbone of the River Grandma program. She organized a fundraiser with the city council, redesigned the lesson plans, even reached out to the local high school to start a junior lifeguard initiative. The kids adored her. The parents, many of whom had once whispered behind their hands about what she did to her mother, began to smile when they saw her. She still lived in the guest shed. She never asked to move back into the house. That restraint, that understanding of boundaries meant more to me than any words ever could. But one night, a storm rolled in fast and brutal. Thunder cracked like a whip. Wind tore through the trees. Rain hammered the roof like it was trying to get in. I stood at the window watching the dock sway under the assault. Then I saw the shed. its door flapping in the wind. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, cursing the years in my knees, and made my way out. When I opened the shed door, I found Susan huddled in the corner, curled under a blanket, shivering. She looked up, startled. "I'm fine," she said, too quickly. I didn't answer, just held out my hand. "Come inside," I said. "Just for tonight." Her lip quivered, and she took my hand. Hospitals had always made me uneasy. Too white, too cold, too full of waiting and words that change lives in half a sentence. But when Susan asked me to come with her to her first chemo session, I didn't hesitate. Not because I'd forgiven everything, not because things were perfect, but because she was still my daughter, and when your child reaches for you, even after everything, your hands remember how to catch. We left the cabin early that morning, just as the sky began to pinken behind the cliffs. The air smelled like mesquite, and the river was unusually still, as if it too was holding its breath. Susan drove. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching a thermos of black coffee and the knit scarf Helen had given me years ago. Neither of us spoke much. The silence wasn't heavy, just fragile, like porcelain balanced on a ledge. The clinic was in Kingman, a low building tucked between a dentist's office and a tired-looking grocery store. Nothing grand, nothing sterile, just plain. But it was full of people fighting like hell to keep going, and that made it sacred. We checked in. Susan filled out the paperwork, her hands steady, her jaw tight. I sat beside her, watching the other patients. A boy no older than 12, with a shaved head and Star Wars backpack. A woman with no eyebrows humming softly as she knitted. An old man holding hands with his wife, their fingers interlocked like rope. The nurse called her name. We followed. The treatment room was a circle of reclining chairs, IV poles, and soft beeping machines. Windows lined the far wall, letting in desert light that tried its best to feel warm. Susan sat down, rolled up her sleeve, and looked at me. "Will you stay?" she asked. I nodded. I pulled up a chair, opened my book, but I didn't read. I watched her, as the needle went in, as the drip began, as her eyes fluttered closed and her body stilled, like she was surrendering not to weakness, but to something larger, something necessary. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quiet. "I used to be terrified of needles," she said. "When I was little, I'd scream so loud the whole office could hear." I smiled faintly. "Frank used to carry lollipops in his pocket, said every battle deserved a reward." "I remember that," she whispered. Silence again. Then, "Do you think he'd be ashamed of me?" The question cut deep. I turned to her. "No," I said firmly. "Frank believed in second chances. He gave me one when I didn't think I deserved it. He'd do the same for you." She blinked fast, bit her lip. "I keep thinking," she said, "about that night, the river. How still you were. I thought you were gone, and a part of me." She didn't finish. "You're still here," I said softly. "That's what matters." End. The nurse checked her vitals, adjusted the drip. Susan dozed. I sat beside her and let time blur. It became a rhythm. Every Tuesday and Friday we'd drive to Kingman together. I'd pack sandwiches. She'd pack crossword puzzles. On good days, we'd joke about the hospital food. On bad days, I'd hold her hand while she threw up or cried or both. I watched her lose her hair, then her appetite, then, slowly, her energy. But not her will. No, Susan fought like hell. Not loud, not with fanfare, but with the quiet kind of grit that digs in and says, "Not yet." Back home, she still showed up at the dock, tired, pale, but present. The kids adjusted fast. They didn't care about the scarf she wore or the weight she lost. They only cared that she remembered their names, that she laughed at their jokes, that she listened. One afternoon, Michael asked her, "Why do you still come if you're sick?" She looked at him, smiled weakly, and said, "Because the river keeps flowing, and I want to keep flowing with it." That night, I found her sitting alone by the fire pit, wrapped in 3 blankets and staring into the flames. "I miss Dad," she said. "I do too," I replied. "I wish I'd listened more. I wish I hadn't tried so hard to be someone else." I sat beside her. The fire crackled, Coyotes howled somewhere in the hills. "You are who you are," I said, "and you're becoming someone better every day. That's all that matters now." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in decades, I let mine rest against hers. Not because the past was gone, but because the future was still possible. Recovery doesn't happen all at once. It arrives in pieces like spring returning to a wintered garden, one green shoot at a time, a laugh that doesn't sound forced, a day without nausea, a morning when the hairbrush isn't full of what's been lost. For Susan, recovery was a quiet revolution. It began with strength, just enough to walk the dock again without needing to sit every 5 minutes. Then came appetite, a craving for cinnamon toast that made me tear up when I saw her eat 2 full slices without flinching. The scarf stayed for a while, wrapped snug around her head, but the day she left it on the dresser and walked out bareheaded, wind in her thinning hair, I knew she'd turned a corner. She still had appointments, follow-ups, blood tests, scans, but the doctors were hopeful. Remarkable response, they called it, resilient system. But I knew better. It wasn't just medicine. It was the river. It was the work. It was forgiveness. One morning, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee, she turned to me and said, "I want to do something bigger, something that lasts." I raised an eyebrow. "A new fundraiser?" She shook her head. "A conference, a weekend-long workshop for the community. River safety, rescue techniques, first aid, environmental education. Not just for kids, for everyone. Teenagers, parents, even seniors." I let the idea sit in the space between us like morning fog. Then I nodded. "You thinking spring?" She grinned. "Absolutely." And just like that, we began. We called it The River Teaches, a weekend retreat by the shoreline, with tents, stations, demonstrations, guest speakers, and even live simulations in the water. The mayor pledged support. The fire department sent rescue divers. Even the state wildlife agency agreed to do a workshop on conservation and river health. Susan coordinated everything. Spreadsheets, flyers, registrations. Her energy surprised me. It scared me, too. I worried she was pushing too hard, moving too fast. But when I tried to bring it up, she just smiled. "Mama, I don't want to waste one good day. Not anymore." The kids helped set up. Michael built a wooden sign by the entrance. "Welcome to the River Teaches, Wisdom from Water." The first morning of the conference, I woke early. The dock was still, the river like glass. Susan stood barefoot near the edge, arms crossed, watching the sky change color. "You ready?" I asked. She turned. "As I'll ever be." And we were. The weekend was a triumph. Over 200 people came, some locals, some from nearby towns, families, teachers, retirees, even a few tourists who'd stumbled on the flyers and decided to stay a few days longer. I watched as Susan stood before the first crowd, her voice steady, her posture strong. She told her story, not all of it, but enough. Enough to show them that survival isn't weakness, that learning is a lifelong act of courage. She said, "The river doesn't just carry water, it carries history, lessons, warnings, beauty. And if we listen closely, it teaches us how to carry each other." People applauded. Some cried. And I, sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering, felt something shift inside me. A releasing, not of grief, of control. For so many years, I'd clung tightly to everything. The cabin, the dock, the stories, the legacy. I thought letting go meant forgetting, that handing over the torch meant stepping into shadow. But watching Susan, seeing the way people leaned in to hear her, the way they responded, the way Michael watched her with the wide-eyed admiration he once reserved for me, I knew it was time. Time to start planning for what came next. That night, after the last tent was taken down and the campfire had gone to embers, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Not a will. Not yet. But something more important. A letter. To whoever would come next. A future river grandma. A teacher. A mother. A boy with too many questions. A girl with a stubborn jaw. I wrote, "The river will change. So will you. That's how it works. But if you remember to listen to the water, to the children, to yourself, You'll always know what to do. Don't chase legacy. Live it. Build it one lesson at a time. And never forget, the strongest thing you can be is gentle. The call came just after sunset. Susan was rinsing dishes. I was knitting by the fire, listening to the frogs begin their nightly chorus. Michael burst through the screen door, face pale, breath ragged. "It's Danny," he gasped. "He's missing." I stood so quickly the yarn dropped to the floor. "What happened?" I asked, already reaching for my boots. "He was at the river with his older cousin. Said he just wanted to wade in. Then he was gone. The current's strong today. His cousin didn't see where he went." Susan's face drained of color. "How long?" "Maybe 40 minutes. They've already called the fire department. I ran straight here." We didn't speak. We just moved. Susan grabbed the emergency bags. I slung the portable spotlight over my shoulder. Michael jumped back on his bike, leading the way toward the dock. The sun was nearly gone, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and gold. The river shimmered dark and fast, swollen from upstream rain. By the time we reached the shoreline, flashing lights painted the trees red and blue. A search team was already out with boats and drones. Parents huddled together, some crying, some shouting. Danny's mother, Lisa, stood barefoot in the mud, screaming his name into the wind. Susan ran to her, held her, said nothing but stayed. I moved toward the incident commander, a woman I'd trained with years ago. She knew me, trusted me. I didn't need to explain. "We're scanning up and down both bends," she said, "but lights fading fast." "Where was he last seen?" I asked. She pointed toward the bend near Copper Point, a notoriously tricky stretch of water with hidden roots and sudden drop-offs. I nodded. Michael tugged my sleeve. "You're not going in, are you?" "I'm not asking permission," I said gently, and I waded in. The cold wrapped around my waist like memory. My breath caught, but I kept moving, deeper, until I could swim. I used a wide, deliberate stroke eyes scanning every swirl, every log, every echo. The river was loud now, churning, hiding. I dove, came up empty, dove again. Nothing. On the shore, Susan organized the children, gave them flashlights, created a line, told them to call if they saw anything: clothing, movement, even ripples. Her voice was clear, sharp, unshaking. That's when I saw it. A flash of red caught in a cluster of branches near the far bank. A sleeve? A shoe? I dove one more time. My hand touched cloth. And then, movement. A child. Limp. Floating half submerged. Skin pale. Mouth open. I grabbed him, kicked hard toward shore, screaming, "Here, I've got him." They met me in the shallows. Hands pulled him from my arms, laid him down. Someone began CPR. Susan dropped to her knees, pressing rhythmically, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Tears streaked her cheeks. "Come on, Danny," she said. "Come on, baby boy." Time stretched. Then he coughed, a ragged, wheezing sound, full of river water and hope. He blinked, cried, and the crowd erupted. Susan collapsed beside him, sobbing. I stood back, watching the lights blur through my wet lashes. Alive. He was alive. That night, we sat by the fire again, exhausted, mud-streaked, silent. Susan sipped tea with trembling hands. I reached over, grasped them, held tight. "I'm proud of you," I said. She looked at me, eyes wide. "I mean it. You didn't freeze. You didn't break. You led. You saved him." Her voice cracked. "You started it. You taught me how to be someone worth saving." We sat there as the fire crackled low. The river outside whispered its endless song, and we truly knew what it meant to be part of something bigger than ourselves. I used to rise with the sun, like clockwork. No alarm, no nudges, just instinct and old bones trained by decades of dockside discipline. But lately, the sunrise would peek through the curtains before I could get out of bed, and when I did rise, my knees sang louder than the birds. At first, I brushed it off just a cold morning, too much time in the river, maybe a little salt in the joints. But it kept happening. Slower steps, dizzier spells. I found myself taking deeper breaths to do things I used to do without thinking. Susan noticed. She didn't say anything at first, but I caught the way she started packing the bags before I even got to the kitchen, how she walked half a step behind me, ready to catch if I stumbled. She began taking over the morning introductions with the kids, organizing the lesson plans, handling the guest speakers who came to visit. I should have felt replaced, but I didn't. I felt relieved, because she wasn't taking the torch from me. I was handing it to her. One Sunday, after the last of the kids had been picked up and the sun dipped low behind the canyon walls, I sat on the dock with my feet in the water. Susan brought me a cup of sweet tea and sat beside me. We didn't speak for a long while. Then she asked, "When did you know it was time to slow down?" I smiled. "I haven't. My body did." She chuckled. "Fair enough." The river shimmered gold beneath our feet. A heron drifted low, skimming the water like a ghost. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens next." I turned to her. "You mean when I go?" She looked pained. I didn't want to say it like that. "You don't have to," I said gently. "It's coming. I feel it. Not tomorrow, not next week, but sometime soon." Her eyes glistened. "I don't want to lose you." "You already did once," I said. "And look, we're here, stronger." She wiped her cheek, nodded. "I've started writing things down. The class curriculum, contact lists, emergency procedures. I want it to be solid just in case." "I know," I said, "and I'm glad." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping in the top drawer of my nightstand for over a year. "I've already written the bylaws," I said, "for the foundation." She blinked. "Foundation?" I nodded. "The River Grandma Trust. After I'm gone, this program becomes non-profit, fully registered, fully protected. The cabin becomes the official headquarters. The funds from my pension, savings, and small royalties from my father's old journal sales will fund it for at least 10 years. She took the folder, eyes wide. "I want you to be executive director," I said. "Mama." "No arguments. You're ready." She opened the folder slowly, hands trembling. "You've thought of everything," she whispered. "I've had time," I said with a smirk. "Too much time some days." We sat in silence again. "I still remember the first day you took me to the river," she said. "I was 4, scared to dip my toes in. You sat beside me, said the river was like a wise old friend, that it never rushed you, just waited." I smiled. "That's how I want you to run the program. Like the river?" "Exactly." She nodded, clutching the folder to her chest. That week, I stopped teaching the Sunday class. Susan took over fully. She wore the old whistle Frank had used when coaching Little League. The kids loved it, said it made her sound official. Michael now, almost 18, tall and lean, became her assistant coach. Watching them together reminded me of myself and my father. The way I once looked at him like he hung the stars. Susan invited me to sit in on class, but I chose to watch from the porch instead. Not because I couldn't teach, but because I wanted to see her fly. And she did. Beautifully. One night, as she was locking up the shed, she found me staring at the photo wall inside the one with pictures of every kid who'd ever graduated the program. Over 300 faces. So many stories. So much river. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded slowly. I think I finally understand why my father was so quiet near the end." "Why?" "Because there's peace in seeing the work live on without you. It hurts, but it heals too." She leaned against the doorway. "We won't be without you, Mama." "I know," I whispered. "But someday," I added, "the stories will be yours to tell." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. It wasn't a funeral. It wasn't even called a farewell. Susan called it a river gathering. Just a quiet Sunday, where everyone who'd been touched by the water, by the lessons, by the stories, could come together one more time. Share a meal, tell a memory, listen to the current flow. I agreed, but only on one condition. No crying, I told her. And no speeches about how I never gave up. I gave up plenty. I just came back. She smiled. "Deal." We planned it for mid-autumn, when the air was crisp and the leaves along the canyon burned gold. The dock was decorated with faded river maps, childhood drawings, and old photographs. Frank holding Susan as a baby, a young me with a whistle around my neck. A group shot of the very first class under the River Grandma sign. We set up folding chairs along the shoreline. A table full of cornbread, chili, and lemonade. No balloons, no loud music, just soft guitar, played by one of Michael's friends, and the sound of the river steady, calm, as if it too was leaning in to listen. People came, more than I expected. Danny, now 12 and proudly taller than Susan, brought his science fair ribbon to show me. Because I did my project on river rescue, he beamed. Michael brought his college acceptance letter. Helen showed up with her grandkids. Ed Ramirez came 2 older now, hair white, but his handshake still firm as ever. Even Lisa, the once worried mother from the CPR night, brought a pie and hugged me so long I nearly forgot how old we both were. I sat in the old rocking chair Frank built decades ago, wrapped in the same shawl Susan gave me after her first chemo session. The chair creaked just right, the breeze smelled of pine and riverstone, and the sun laid down a blanket of gold across the yard. Then Susan stepped forward, cleared her throat, and broke our deal just a little. Most of you know her as River Grandma, she said. Some of you knew her as Maggie. A few of you knew her before that as the girl who outran every boy in town, who swam upstream just to prove she could. The crowd chuckled. She taught us how to float, how to read a current, how to listen. But more than that, she taught us how to stay, how to stand when it's easier to run, how to forgive, how to build something that lasts. I gave her a look. She smiled through tears. Sorry, no crying, I know. Then she stepped back, and they all looked at me, waiting. I stood slowly, let the silence settle, and then I spoke. My father taught me one thing, I said, that the river will always flow, whether you watch it or ignore it, whether you understand it or fear it. It doesn't stop, it just moves, always. I looked around, at the faces of generations. He said the best thing a person can do is learn how to move with it, not against it, to read its warnings, to respect its power, and to help others do the same. A breeze passed through the trees. I took a breath. I've made mistakes, I said, more than most. I've held on too tightly to things that needed to be let go, and I've let go too quickly when I should have stayed. But through it all, this river has never abandoned me. Susan came and stood beside me. I placed my hand on hers. This program, this dock, this cabin, it's not just mine anymore. It's yours. It belongs to every child who ever learned to swim here, to every parent who stayed late helping fold towels, to every teacher who asked, "Can I help?" even when they didn't have time. The crowd was silent. Tears, smiles, quiet nods. And to Susan, I added, turning to her, who walked away, yes, but who came back, and who stayed, him. I handed her the old whistle. She took it, hands shaking. She's ready, I said, more than ready. A long moment passed. Then the crowd stood and clapped, not loud, not wild, just steady, like the river. Later that evening, when most had gone home, Susan and I sat on the porch in silence. The stars blinked awake overhead. "Did I do okay?" she asked. I smiled. "You did just fine." She passed on a Thursday, quietly. No pain, no struggle, just a slow, steady breath, then none. Susan found her in the rocker by the window, wrapped in the old river shawl, a book open in her lap. Outside, the water flowed as it always had, as if the river itself was keeping vigil. There was no funeral. That had been her wish. Instead, Susan gathered everyone on the dock that Sunday, just like always. The kids came in their life jackets, some with tears, others with stories. The parents brought cornbread and lemonade, like she'd asked. Michael stood tall, holding a candle, eyes glassy but proud. And then Susan stepped forward. She held a letter in both hands, worn at the folds, written in Maggie's slanted script. She read aloud, "To the ones still listening. If you're hearing this, then I've gone back to the water. Maybe not in body, but in soul, in current, in the spaces between wind and wave. Don't be sad for me. The river gave me more life than most ever get, and more love than I thought I deserved. End of trip. Take care of the dock, patch the boards, coil the ropes right, keep the whistle clean. But more than that, take care of each other. This place isn't magic because I was here. It's magic because you are. When you teach a child to float, you teach them how not to sink in the water, yes, but also in life. When you listen to someone's fear, you help carry it. And when you forgive, oh, when you forgive, you give someone the chance to come home. Let the river teach you, and when it's your time, teach someone else. I'll be there, in the wind, in the splash, in the stories you tell at dusk. Don't forget to laugh. And don't forget, the strongest thing you can be is gentle. They say the river never stops flowing. Neither do her stories. And every time a child takes their first step into that water, arms trembling but heart wide open, Maggie is there, watching, guiding, smiling, forever part of the current. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter a new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving. And I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.